It's my pleasure to welcome you back to Lusk Perspectives. Today we are going to have a panel on how COVID is affecting state and local government finances, which is particularly important to those of us in the real estate business because, one, it determines the taxes that we're going to pay. And I know people in real estate are obsessed with the taxes that they're going to pay. But also whether you're going to get the government services that you need in order for your real estate to maintain value. For example, we know school quality is a very important predictor of residential real estate value. And so cutbacks in school spending can have a pretty profound effect on the real estate market. Similarly, basic services, garbage collection, police and fire, EMT services, et cetera. Do roads remain paved? Are pretty important to real estate valuation. And so we thought it would be worth spending an hour focusing on this issue. We have just a great group of three people to do this, leading the conversation, and the person who will be introducing our other two panelists is Lois Takahashi. Lois joined us at the Price School at USC about 2 years ago. She runs our Sacramento Center and is the Flournoy professor in the Price School. Before she was here, she was at another very fine school located in Los Angeles, where she ran a number of things, including a research center on issues facing Asian and Pacific Islanders, and was an interim dean for a while. I say to people, and it's really true, she gave about the best job talk I ever saw when she came down here to interview at USC. I just enjoyed it so much, I can't even begin to describe it. And we're really glad she's here. And so with that, Lois, please take it away and introduce our other panelists. And unlike any other Lusk Perspective, I'm going to disappear from view because the internet is kind of overwhelmed at the moment. So we're trying to have as few people on video as possible. But it doesn't mean I'm not with you. So Lois, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Richard Green, for that really nice introduction. It's always great to have somebody prep up my ego right before I give a talk, or give an introduction. It's my really distinct pleasure to introduce these two panelists today who, as Richard Green so nicely described, will be talking about state and local finance issues in this COVID-19, wildfire, and rolling blackouts and everything else context. So the structure of the webinar will be that I will introduce first the two panelists, and then each will give about a 5-minute overview of the issues from her perspective, especially in these turbulent times, and then we can move on to a conversation before taking as many questions as we can. So let me first introduce our two panelists. Carolyn Coleman is Executive Director of the League of California Cities. League of California Cities advances policies to expand and protect local control for cities through education and advocacy to enhance the quality of life for all Californians. She joined the League of California Cities in 2016 after a decade with the National League of Cities in Washington, D.C. as Senior Executive and Director of Federal Advocacy. During her tenure at the National League of Cities, she worked closely with city leaders from across the country and the 49 state municipal leagues to advance federal policies that expand local control and provide funding for local programs related to housing, transportation, public safety, and infrastructure. Prior to working with the National League of Cities, Ms. Coleman served as deputy mayor for the city of Indianapolis, where she focused on affordable housing, economic development, infrastructure, and community engagement. She previously practiced law and held marketing leadership positions in the private sector. In addition to her professional endeavors, Ms. Coleman serves on the board of trustees of the University of Indianapolis and on the Dean's Cabinet at the McGeorge School of Law here in Sacramento. She is also a governor appointee to the California Complete Count Committee and serves on the boards of the National League of Cities and the California Foundation on the Environment and the Economy, or CFE. So welcome, Carolyn Coleman. Dr. Tracy Gordon is Senior Fellow with the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center in Washington, D.C. She studies fiscal challenges facing state and local governments. Excuse me, a little smoky over here. Including budget trade-offs, intergovernmental relations, and long-term sustainability. Before joining the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center, she was senior economist with the White House Council of Economic Advisors. She was also fellow at the Brookings Institution, assistant professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, and fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. Dr. Gordon was a member of the District of Columbia Infrastructure Task Force and the District of Columbia Tax Revision Commission. She serves on the Board of Trustees for the American Tax Policy Institute and the National Tax Association. She's written extensively on state and local government finances, including taxes, budgeting, intergovernmental relations, municipal debt, and pensions. She's appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Washington Post, and on C-SPAN, Fox Business News, and National Public Radio. Dr. Gordon holds a PhD in public policy with a concurrent master's degree in economics from the University of California, Berkeley, which I hear is also a very good institution. So welcome to you both. Let's start with Tracy Gordon. Dr. Gordon, what are your thoughts on state and local finance issues?
Thank you so much for having me here today. I do want to say a little bit about where I'm from as well. I need to update that bio. But the Tax Policy Center is a joint urban Brookings venture, as you mentioned, and I'm part of the State and Local Finance Initiative. And the State and Local Finance Initiative is really about anything having to do with revenues, spending, borrowing, investing among state and local governments. We come out of the tradition of the Tax Policy Center in terms of trying to look at the distributional and revenue effects of tax changes using the latest state-of-the-art modeling techniques. And we come out of the tradition of the Urban Institute in terms of trying to integrate findings from across the Center for Justice Policy, metropolitan communities, health policy, and what all of the research in those areas of the Urban Institute means for state and local governments. So, we are nonpartisan. We provide independent and objective analysis. We don't have a dog in the fight. And we've been very busy lately. I love talking about state and local government. I wish it weren't under these circumstances. But I did bring a graph. So if we could get that up. There we go. As everyone knows, the COVID-19 pandemic and recession have been sort of an economic asteroid that's hit us. For state and local governments, the initial shocks from the pandemic and recession have been worse than the initial shocks from the Great Recession. So looking at a 3-month average of state tax revenues from March, April, and May, personal income tax collections declined about 40%, sales taxes declined about 12%, and overall taxes were down about 30%. And this compares to about 30% decline for personal income taxes, 9% for sales taxes, and about 20% for overall taxes in the Great Recession. Now, I promised that I would have some ray of sunshine here because everybody was very freaked out when they saw this figure before we started the call. But some of these declines are only temporary. So the federal government, when the pandemic first hit, extended income tax filing deadlines until July, and states soon followed. So in California, for example, the Legislative Analyst's Office had a tracker where they posted the expected personal income tax revenues and actual personal income tax revenues in April, and the governor's budget assumed $18 billion, and they actually got $5 billion, but that was expected because people were not filing their taxes. So now that July has come and gone, people have filed their taxes, and so some of this will be made back. But of course, the economy is still not looking great. And so there are a lot of macroeconomic analyses that show the link between unemployment rates and state budgets. Basically, with the Congressional Budget Office now projecting that unemployment will remain upwards of 8% by the end of next year, and in fact not regain its pre-pandemic level until the end, or by the end of the projection period, by 2030, we're still going to have elevated unemployment, although not quite at the levels we're seeing now, they project. So that means that the revenue picture is not going to improve dramatically for state and local governments. So you've got this revenue hit on the one hand. States are now projecting about a $200 billion cumulative loss. Cities are now projecting about, and that's about an 11% loss compared to what they were forecasting. Cities are now projecting a 13% loss. And then spending is going up for direct expenses, things like personal protective equipment or disinfecting public spaces or switching to remote learning, as well as indirect costs resulting from people accessing the safety net more. So the budget that just passed in California included projections from the governor's office that they will see something like a 50% increase in people using the state's version of food stamps, 20% increase in Medicaid. So far, a lot of these increases in Medicaid have not come to pass, but so far also people have been laid off temporarily, and a lot of economists think that that is about to change. We're seeing increases in permanent unemployment. So there is this very significant structural problem. There are a lot of sources of uncertainty. I don't want to mitigate that. The federal government has done a lot so far, spending in March, about 9% of revenues for a single year on these three major pieces of legislation that passed in that month alone. That certainly helped prop up spending and state and local finances initially. But as everyone probably knows, we are now kind of in this waiting game to see what the federal government will do next. A lot of relief is time limited or subject to declarations of a public health emergency. And so, in my view, has not fully recognized the fiscal emergency facing state and local government.
Thank you so much.
Take that graph away now.
Scary graph. It was very scary. Let me turn then to Carolyn Coleman. Carolyn, what are your thoughts about state and local finance given this context that Dr. Gordon has just presented to us?
Well, thank you, Lois, for inviting me to join you today. And it's always a pleasure to be on a panel with Tracy. I learned something every time. I'm going to focus quite a bit on the local picture and share sort of what cities were doing pre-COVID and what has happened through COVID and what we're focused on going forward. If you wind back the clock to March 2020, which now seems like it was years ago, cities were focused on about 5 different things at the state level in our partnership with Governor Newsom and the legislature. We know in the state we need to do more to produce more housing, and we need to produce housing that's affordable across the income spectrum. We also, as cities, realize that homelessness is top of mind for so many, and we needed to continue the partnership with the state to address homelessness in our communities. And what's a conversation without talking about the pension liability and the increasing cost of pensions for our state and also our local governments. So we were interested and continue to work with the governor, the legislature, and CalPERS on that issue. And before COVID, there were wildfires, and we were very focused on wildfires in recent years, and so cities were working to strengthen their resiliency and also their disaster preparedness. And then finally, public safety, which is perennially top of mind for all of us. So that's how we began the year. We had a very productive and candid conversation with Governor Newsom in February about all of these issues, and look forward to a strong partnership in 2020. And then in March, the brakes really hit with COVID-19. The governor began issuing a series of executive orders to protect the health of our residents. Local communities were doing the same. We were establishing testing sites. And as Dr. Gordon has mentioned, we shut down our local economies and our local businesses, which are the lifelines of the revenues that cities need to operate. As she has mentioned, and then you can go to the first slide, these efforts, while they have saved lives, have resulted in deep and devastating hits on local budgets, not just here in California, but nationwide. And you see here just some of the headlines from the local media as well as national media talking about the impact that the COVID-19 has had on state finances in California and in other places. We now have, as Tracy has mentioned, significant unplanned expenditures for a pandemic that no one could have seen coming. And we're also facing, due to the shutdowns of our local economies, pretty severe revenue shortfalls. By our count, they're to the tune of $7 billion over the next 18 months for California local governments. If you go to the next slide, and to give you a sense of the revenue sources that are impacted, obviously sales make up the biggest chunk of those revenues, but there are also a whole host of other revenues that have been disrupted by COVID-19. I mentioned sales taxes also in our state. People like to visit California. Tourism is a primary revenue driver for our local communities. But we've seen a tremendous drop off in our hotel taxes or transient occupancy taxes. So the combination of a $7 billion revenue shortfall and millions of dollars in unplanned expenses means shortfalls in budgets. And when we have shortfalls in budgets, we have to cut services. Unlike the federal government, local governments have to balance their budget. Next slide, please. And this will give you just a sense of what kinds of services at the local level will be impacted. But first, let me say this data that you're seeing, we went out in April. Very early on, we wanted to get a sense of the fiscal impact, and we also wanted to get a sense at how quickly this impact would be felt at the local level. And so the results of our surveys, this is what our cities told us. And I can tell you that 9 in 10 cities or local governments are projecting that they will have to either cut services or cut staff because of the budget shortfalls. And then 4 in 5 of our cities are saying they're going to have to do some combination of both. I think what's so important about this slide is that, you know, there are 482 cities in California, obviously with different population sizes. But what this slide shows is that no community is being spared and no part of the state is being spared when it comes to budget shortfalls, meaning we're going to have to cut back in services. Richard, in his opening remarks, talked a little bit about the importance of a local government being able to provide services like police and fire, like trash pickup, like addressing homelessness, like permitting and inspection so houses can get built. All of those are central to the quality of life in a community, but the impact of COVID has been fast and it's been deep. And what we will soon be seeing are cutbacks in all of these services. But all is you know, we're not giving up as cities. We have been lobbying the state government for fiscal assistance, and we greatly appreciate the Federal CARES Act dollars that went directly to the top 6 cities in California. That will go a long way to helping offset expenses. We also greatly appreciated the $500 million that Governor Newsom and the legislature sent to those communities that were smaller than 500,000 in population. Those resources are great, but they don't begin to fill the types of budget shortfalls that you see in these slides. And also, very importantly, those dollars coming from the federal government through the CARES Act, while welcome, were restricted to, can only be used to offset expenses. They cannot be used to offset the revenue shortfalls. So those shortfalls overall continue for our cities, and we are continuing to work very hard at the state level to request additional assistance, and also, like Governor Newsom and the legislature and so many others, local governments around the country are also still seeking and urging the federal government and Congress and the president to look at a 4th stimulus and to include resources that would help local governments not only offset these unplanned expenses that will go on until the foreseeable future, but also to help us offset the big revenue shortfalls. You know, at the end of the day, cities are an essential partner in the recovery in this country. And so I say the state and I say the feds, as we transition to reopening our economy safely and recovering from the pandemic and the recession, that investments in our local communities ought to be top of mind. So thank you, Lois. I look forward to the questions and the conversation.
Before we start the conversation, Dr. Gordon, do you have any comments on what Carolyn Coleman has just talked about in terms of federal stimulus?
Yes, I do. So the CARES Act, you know, I think there's been a lot in the news lately about the Treasury Department had a report that said something like 25% of those funds, about $150 billion, had been spent. And therefore, those funds were available for a supplemental unemployment benefit that the president created through a presidential memorandum. The State Association of Budget Officers quickly pointed out that even if states hadn't actually gotten that money out the door yet, they had appropriated it or planned to spend it for various things. And so, you know, on the one hand, the Treasury Department actually, they've changed their guidance several times on how to use the CARES funds. They've taken a more open view of what counts as a direct expense that's related to COVID. So things like switching to remote learning, I think there's even some guidance that says, okay, really any payroll that's associated with public safety, public education, it's all good. But that's for this year. It runs out at the end of this year. And I think there's some talk on the Hill, Carolyn may know better than I, about extending the period during which you could use the CARES funds, but it's still only $150 billion, which is insufficient to the challenge that we're facing. I saw, yeah, I'll let us get to questions and we can flesh this out a little bit more.
So before we get to the questions, let me ask you about these cliffs we've been hearing so much about. When some of these stimulus funds run out and some of these moratoria get lifted, people are projecting eviction cliffs, all kinds of even more horrible things happening. Carolyn Coleman, what's your sense about these cliffs, how quickly they would happen, the sequence of them, and how differentially they would affect different cities across the state of California?
Yeah, I think Lois, the cliffs are real, and two of them are on my mind. One has to do with the eviction moratorium. I think the state moved pretty quickly, and some local governments moved very quickly last spring to put those in place, recognizing that when the economies got shut down, it meant people were furloughed, and so their finances were also being disrupted the same way, frankly, local government and the state government was. I believe in California, the eviction moratorium runs through September 2nd. I know that the administration, the governor and legislators are looking at that very closely, some options to extend that. And we are very anxious to hear about the fruit of those talks. And I know a number of communities also still have moratoriums in place. Having the eviction moratorium lifted and having folks lose their housing at a point in time where, we cannot mass congregate. So the normal safety net shelter system, if you will, although not perfect, isn't going to be available. So, the good thing we could do is to help folks stay in place while we manage through this. But I also recognize that, you have landlords involved who also have interest. They might have mortgages that they're trying to play. I believe there's a federal moratorium, COVID related, that extends out for some time. That's great if it's a federally insured mortgage. But I think there's a gap to be filled here with those mortgages that are not federally backed. So that in the short term, very quickly here is a cliff that is approaching. The legislature's got a few more days to get some work done, and I hope this is something that they pay attention to. The other thing I'd say about the eviction moratoriums, let's not forget that at least in the state of California, people of color were disproportionately impacted from a health perspective by COVID, and also with the disruption in the economy and their workplaces. As we think about recovery, as we think about building and reinforcing the safety net for this pandemic, which we are going to coexist with for some time now, I encourage us to continue to look at equity and to look at how we do what we do with a lens of equity, so that we do not further inequities that are built into the system, unintentionally or not.
Could I ask just Carolyn a quick clarification question?
Mm-hmm. Of course.
So your slide, you had a $7 billion shortfall for municipalities in revenue. What's the denominator? What would a normal amount of collections be in a year?
Oh gosh, I don't have that number, Richard. I do have, I think, someone on the phone that might be able to get that answer for us.
Okay, great. Because it would be helpful to know, are you talking about 10% or 40%, basically, in terms of how catastrophic this is?
Yeah, can I give you just an example for a city? Because I know sometimes in Washington speak, we talk in terms of billions and trillions of dollars, but when it really comes down to the state, we're talking about a city by city basis and the impact there. So let me give you an example of, this is Santa Clara County. Closer to home, Santa Clara County is projecting a $285 million budget deficit. Alameda County is forecasting a 10% drop in sales tax revenues from its $3.1 million budget. Oakland, an $80 million budget hole. And San Jose announced in April that it was forecasting a $71 million deficit, and it's now expected to hit $100 million. And so, you know, on a city by city basis is really how I think we have to look at these things.
I agree.
If I could jump in.
I'm sorry, Tracy, please.
Well, just one thing that I really appreciated about that chart, because again, from a sort of bird's eye view, we often focus on, at the local level, property taxes, income taxes, sales taxes, fees. But these little taxes that Carolyn mentioned and that showed up in the slide, the hotel occupancy taxes and transient occupancy taxes, you know, those are down in places like LA and New York on the order of 70 or 80%. So even though it's not one of the big revenue sources, one of the big pots of money nationally, for certain cities, you know, that people, as Carolyn mentioned, like to visit, it is revenue that they were expecting, that it's not clear when that money is going to come back. And I just, you know, honestly, I'm just not used to seeing losses like that in the 70 to 80% category. So, you know, these little pots of money are meaningful, and especially to the individual jurisdictions that Carolyn mentioned.
So maybe I could follow up with a question from one of our audience members about sales taxes, because we've seen this rise in online shopping. I mean, a lot of these corporate success stories are all about the pivot to online shopping. Where do all those taxes go?
So I will, again, you know, answer generally, and then I'm sure Carolyn has things to say about California's specific way of divvying up state and local money. But you know, the good news for states before this, and I also want to accentuate, you know, sort of how things looked in January, February of this year compared to March. You know, states went into this with their highest savings on record, about 8% of spending in a given year. Cities too had incredibly high savings, about 30% of spending, which is higher than prior to the Great Recession. So again, you know, these governments didn't do anything wrong. This sort of economic asteroid hit them. You know, and hit these revenue sources that we mentioned, as well as these spending areas. But the sort of good pieces of news prior to March were that the Supreme Court issued a decision, the Wayfair versus South Dakota decision, that said that states could actually require online retailers to collect sales taxes. They didn't have to, and for a long time, this was fought with the idea that it was just too complicated, because at the local level, they might tax different things, they might have different rates, and then at the state level, it's all different. And what is a multi-jurisdiction company to do? And, you know, of course, you know, as someone who at least used to ride taxi cabs where they have little Square and other kinds of apps that, you know, take into account all this variation, I never quite understood why this is such an insurmountable challenge. But nevertheless, the sort of good news going into this was that, you know, states and localities were forecasting pretty good revenue growth, in part because of that Wayfair decision. And if you look at consumption, that's one area where consumption has kept up. So groceries, Home Depot, Lowe's, and online purchases. Other stuff, and this is a big deal at the local level, like durable goods purchases, cars, that is way down, and obviously services is way down. And you know, there's a really interesting question for anybody who cares about cities. A lot of high cost, you know, sort of knowledge, information centered economies are seeing people working from home, which is great. Thank goodness we have that option. But also that means that we're not going out and buying lattes and supporting local businesses. And so some of the, you know, high frequency data with job listings and that sort of thing is showing that it's those, you know, high productivity, high functioning metros that are actually doing the worst for low skilled workers, as Carolyn mentioned. So, you know, everyone has talked about what will the shape of the recovery be? Will it be a V? Will it be a, you know, tilde sign, a Nike sign? The thing that's kind of stuck with me lately is this K-shaped recovery, where there are going to be some types of people who are able to recover fast and some who are just really, you know, doing worse and worse. And I think I agree completely. We really need to keep that front of mind.
Well, if I could add,
yes,
appreciate Tracy's comments. You know, I think well, I've done my share of online shopping during this pandemic, but I think at the end of the day, what it means is there's a redistribution of where that revenue is going. And we can't tell at this point. And if you're a local government, you've built a budget based on a revenue stream that you expected because you didn't know your businesses were going to shut down. And so what does it look like in, yeah, my local governments are worried, and rightfully so, about 2020 and how 2020, they finished 2020, but they're also thinking hard about what do our revenue receipts and patterns look like in 21 and 22? Because we don't have the data to tell us about how, I don't talk post-COVID anymore. I talk future, what our world looks like. How do we go back to work? Do we all come back in? Probably not. It's a hybrid, and that's going to impact the retail patterns that generate these revenues.
So Carolyn, maybe I can follow up on that a little bit. I mean, how are cities and counties, which is not really your kind of focus, but how are they dealing with this uncertainty in terms of planning for the budget for the next cycle? Because they have to plan, don't they?
Yeah, they've had to plan, and by this point, many of them have, because of their fiscal years, their cycles, have gone to their councils and they have budgets in place. Many of them are passing a budget today, and they've agreed to take another look 6 months from now, because there's such a great deal of uncertainty in the marketplace and in the state of, are we open, are we not open? We were heading down a path of opening. We had to retrench in some instances, and then we've shifted to outdoor dining. And then you have wildfires, which I know, Lois, you are personally familiar with. You have wildfires and now poor air quality that is impacting the ability to serve and to operate those businesses outside. So great deal of uncertainty, but resiliency. And I imagine, much like the state will be doing, there will be several look backs at the budget for planning purposes.
I'd like to say something too about those stay-at-home orders, because I see so much emphasis on, as someone who studies federalism, I've actually found it kind of comical the way that people were sort of arguing over, I get to open the economy. No, I get to open the economy. And at the end of the day, nobody gets to flip a switch and turn the economy back on. And if you look at the data where the stay-at-home orders take effect and when consumption starts to fall, even in states that were relatively late adopters, people were spending less. So even though the economy was open, people were scared and they didn't want to show up. And so, I think that's why, I think we've kind of moved beyond this, I hope, but it's really this false choice between containing the virus and letting the economy grow. You need to contain the virus for people to feel comfortable transacting again in the marketplace.
And so let me continue that line of thinking, Dr. Gordon. So if the economy is doing some things, and you said things are not all bad. We hope that some of these downward declines are temporary. Is there any sense about how temporary these things are? There was a question from the audience. I know we're asking you to prognosticate here, and I swear none of us will repeat anything you say, even though it's reported. We did have a question out there asking whether revenues would be low. Did you say that revenues would still be low until 2030? And why? Why is it taking so long?
Right.
We're really looking for some clarity here. Can you provide us with any?
I saw that question, and thank you for giving me a chance to address it, because no, I did not mean to say that revenues will be low until 2030. The CBO is forecasting that unemployment will be high until 2030, and not as high as it is right now, heaven forbid. But it will remain elevated until the end of next year, and definitely the next couple of years, so 2024, 2025, and that will affect state and local budgets. And one thing that people in the state and local world love to remind people of too is that not only do you have, revenues coming back very slowly, but you've also lost those years of growth in between. And so, just prior to this, people were talking about, the lost decade of the Great Recession that, took, and again, you can't overemphasize the amount of variation that exists. There were some places that came back very quickly from the Great Recession. I think, as Richard alluded to, which was a property-centered recession, a completely different animal than right now. There'll be some places that come back fairly quickly from this, places with few cases, places that don't depend on hospitality and tourism as much, places where the right policies were enacted and people responded in the right way, places that were lucky. So there's so many sources of uncertainty, so much variation, but this is a multi-year problem. I don't think anyone is talking about it lasting through the end of the decade, but the current economic forecast suggests that output will be lower, jobs will be lower through the end of the decade.
So Carolyn Coleman, maybe I can follow up on some of these issues related to public services. We see across the country there are still large protests going on about, especially in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and other places, about public safety, funding of police, defunding of police, all kinds of debates about this. What is your sense about the cities in California and how they're dealing not only with COVID and wildfires and blackouts, but also with this kind of surge of interest and concern about public safety services? Are city councils and your folks rethinking how to allocate the little funding they have now and uncertain funding into the future related to this public safety issue, as well as all these natural disasters?
I think that's just a reality, Lois, that they live with. 2020 has been a bit of the year of the unexpected and unplanned for local governments. And so, there have been long, hard council meetings around the state. Tuesday nights are a busy night in this state. And I think, one, let me just say on the social, the unrest that was sparked by George Floyd's murder back in May. I think in California, what I have observed and witnessed and had conversations with city officials about is a lot of interest about having the conversations. How do we have the conversations that maybe we didn't have 10 years ago about racial equity, about equity in general? What does it mean to talk about systemic racism? And I certainly applaud the city officials and the local leaders for raising their hand and saying, I want to get smarter about this because I want to live in a more equitable community. Again, not just racism, but there's a whole host of inequities. Yes, it's been another unexpected on the budget, and that means that, you've got to go back to the well and say, these are the resources we have. How will we adjust and reset city operations to supply the services and deliver the services in the confines that we have? There's no magic. They don't get to print new money. It's like, I grew up in the Midwest. It's like when snowstorms hit, and you don't plan for those, but every now and then they're going to hit, and you're going to have overtime, and you're going to have to reallocate other things in your budget to meet those needs. But I would say, just on balance, yes, they're being fiscally responsible. But on balance, I'm so proud of all of and so many of the California local officials who have stepped up in the aftermath of George Floyd, and I presume will in the aftermath of the sad incident, tragic incident in Kenosha, Wisconsin earlier this week.
Thank you, Carolyn, for those comments. So Tracy Gordon, how do you see the larger picture at the national level in terms of reallocation of resources, given that there are these issues about public safety, but also other issues that are coming up? Great storms. I mean, it just seems like 2020 is the year of everything, right? As Carolyn. So what are people doing?
I think, it's a tremendously, this is so nerdy, but as a researcher, it's a tremendously exciting time, right? Because this idea that everything is on the table, right? And that we really are thinking about budgets as documents that reflect priorities and values and opportunities to reprogram funds in a way that might achieve the same social objectives better, more equitably, more efficiently. And the idea that there's this loosening up and that we can re-examine some long-held beliefs, I think, and that potentially as a researcher, we could play a role and help with that, is just tremendously exciting to me. I guess I have a friend who wrote an article that got a lot of press about how governors should sort of enjoy their moment in the sun, because in the federal government's, I'll just say, absence in a lot of ways initially, governors really rose to the fore, and there was a lot of talk about the year of the governor. And I'm sure Carolyn would say, don't forget the mayors as well, city council members. But a friend of mine took issue with that sort of, governors are leading the discussion argument by saying things are so bad fiscally that they're going to be in the role of grim accountants for many years to come. And I just really take issue with that. I think there are opportunities for leadership in a crisis. And one of those opportunities is re-examining, long-held beliefs about this is the way we do things. So, I think you will see, people thinking creatively, challenging presumptions, and hopefully governments learning to deliver the goods and services that people want better.
So let me, Richard.
I'm sorry, Lois, but I got an email from Richard Bruckner, who was, among other things, chief planner of Los Angeles County, retired in that job, member of the Lusk board, and he has a question that I think should be floated to the panel, and I just gave him permission to speak.
So my perspective is that when this happens, what the city managers do immediately is put a hiring freeze in place and start to cut. And they try and preserve public safety, which is 50–60% of their budget. So what happens then for the folks who are on the line and in development is that the planning departments, the building departments, those services either get cut disproportionately because they're not public safety, or in combination, they lose staff and are in a freeze. So I am very concerned about the recovery. Also, these downturns are almost counter-cyclical to local governments because they don't feel the hit for 3, 4, 6 months because of the way funds flow through and are distributed to them. So I'm very concerned that when we get through this, and hopefully soon, and development starts to pick up, we're not going to be prepared from the public side to service the private side recovery. And I've seen that through 3 or 4 cycles. So my real concern is how do we deal with that sort of lag we're almost counter-cyclical, and then we're not prepared. And I don't have the answer to that, but I think it's a real concern that people in our industry, the audience today, should be concerned about and watch and lobby their local governments to ensure that they have the resources to come out of this. Sorry.
Hey, Lois, hey, Richard, thank you for the comment. Lois, if I could chime in there. And I don't know, Marilyn, can you go back to my 3rd slide? Richard, I think all excellent points. This chart aims to highlight exactly what you just mentioned in terms of where the impact will be on city services. The tall blue line across the board is planning and housing.
Yep.
And, but I think differently than what we saw, at least what I saw in 2008, you're also seeing severe public safety, hits on public safety as a part of what we're experiencing. I think unlike 2007 and 8, the hit on local budgets has been much faster, and that we don't have the luxury of the 2-year lag that we may have had back in 2007-8 when property taxes were at they were at the core of it for local governments. So I think the hit has been deeper and it's been faster with this pandemic and now recession that we're going into. I couldn't agree with you more about investments as we come out of recovery, because those issues that were challenges for our state before COVID got exacerbated during COVID, and they are still here with us, but even more challenging in some instances. I do think as part of the Great Recession 2007-8, there was across the board a disinvestment in terms of how the priorities fell out in our planning and some of our housing services. And I think we as a state are experiencing the result of that with the need for increased production. So I think your concerns are spot on, and I would just make those tweaks in terms of the differences between 07, 08, and this year.
Can I just add?
Go ahead, Tracy.
The decline in fees, things like construction fees, permitting fees, all of that is related to this decline in economic activity, and those are funds that won't be available for the staffing that Richard's mentioned going forward, right? So I think looking at not just taxes, but other revenue sources is really important. And I just point out that, again, if you look at the national data on job losses so far, about 1.2 million jobs have been lost. The losses are about on the order of 10% for state education, local non-education. The one area that hasn't seen losses of that magnitude is state non-education, and that's because it never recovered from the last recession. And one of the reasons that it didn't was because those are the jobs that people don't think about usually. So state education, that's higher education, some administration of K-12 education. Local education obviously is teachers, local non-education, maybe people feel those services more directly. But state non-education is stuff like the DMV, and maybe those jobs didn't come back because those departments all learned to do their jobs more productively. And I know it's been a lot more pleasant for me lately going to DMV. You can do stuff online, and that's all great. But I think that what looks like a bright point in the data actually is not so bright of a point, because it's really just saying that they already have been cut and they haven't come back. And it's hard to imagine that those cuts aren't going to manifest themselves in people getting less from government than what they would desire.
So let me follow up on that set of issues. We do have a question about whether they're on the flip side in terms of recovery, economic recovery. Will cities see housing development, new housing development, whether it's single family or multifamily housing development, as a way to re-engage the economy in something that's different than trying to get more people back into retail jobs? Carolyn Coleman, what do you think about that?
Lois, I think as we look at investments in recovery, if it's going to be housing, and if it's going to be, the public sector is going to focus on affordable housing and let the market take care of market rate housing. But it's going to take a subsidy to do that. And that's what we were, lobbying the state for earlier. If we're going to increase production and ensure that it happens across all income levels, either from the state or from the feds or from local housing trust funds, it's going to take a subsidy to do that. So to the extent the feds and the state decide to enact some type of recovery and reinvestment programs, I don't want to call it ARA, I would make these kinds of investments at the local level a high priority. They're not only good for the community, there's need for these services and this housing, but they also create jobs. And I would speak to other types of infrastructure investments as we go forward, because it's about jobs as well to accelerate the recovery.
Tracy Gordon, do you have anything to add about that, about housing production and it being an opportunity rather than just being a burden?
I don't. And I guess the one thing though that makes me a little nervous is that, in the last recession, we had a bunch of unemployed construction workers. Now we have a bunch of unemployed baristas and hair cutters and people in the service sector. And just from a macro perspective, I worry about those people finding jobs. So, I'm all for, building more housing, building more infrastructure. But thinking of that as a jobs program, just given the people who are affected, I'm not sure that, the skills are translatable. Which is not to say that, we shouldn't have more in that area. We actually have a brief on our website where I looked at California's infrastructure spending compared to other states. And certainly, the state has made a lot of gains recently, but there are some areas like preparing for climate change where independent evaluations have suggested that there's a lot more that could be done, or addressing the backlog in deferred maintenance. So, ideally there would be some federal assistance to do things like get rid of the backlogs. And I think, Carolyn mentioned the Recovery Act. With the Recovery Act, actually, a lot of that infrastructure spending really helped a lot, and it had high multipliers contrary to the conventional wisdom. So the bang for the buck was greater than people thought. And I think it's because state and local governments, their backs are really against the wall. So they got the money out the door a lot quicker than they normally would.
Carolyn, did you want to follow up with any of that Tracy just mentioned? No? All right, so let me...
and Lois, I would just say one thing, and Tracy underscored it. We have to understand who is unemployed today, and to the extent they're the baristas in retail and other folks, we continue to need to invest in our workforce investment programs. Again, this was an issue before COVID, and COVID just exacerbates that.
We have a question about, maybe I'll let Tracy Gordon take this first. In states that are opening faster than California, are we seeing any data that shows how fast sales tax and other tax revenues are increasing? Are they seeing a significant increase, slow increase, difference? What do you think?
That is a great question. And I don't know. My colleague, Lucy Dadayan, does like a survey of state revenue estimators. And so I would say, watch this space or watch our website and see, what she's writing on that. But so far, I think that question sort of hits the nail on the head that there's going to be a lot of local variation in the data. The most recent data that I think she has is for May, and even that is reporting things that happened in April. And from what I recall, the losses were pretty widespread. But yeah, I think that's exactly the kinds of questions that we're going to be looking at now.
So we only have about 5 more minutes. So let me ask you both. Let me start with Carolyn Coleman. What do you think are the most promising strategies in this midst of horrible news, darkness, and I'm waiting for locusts, but I will knock on wood that doesn't happen where I am. Any practices or strategies that you're seeing from your local folks that seem like they may be working more, or things that people are trying, experimenting with that you think might have promise? I mean, I want to close this out on something more positive.
That's kind of you, Lois. Before I take that, if I could first, I want to respond to Richard's question about the denominator in the $7 billion number. And I think this matches up a little bit with what Tracy was saying about overall the hit to local governments. Your projection, the estimate is 13%. We have it somewhere in the 7 to 10% range. So just depending. And the way I always think about it is $1 less means $1 less in terms of a person to do a service or a service itself. Thanks, Lois, for ending us on a bright note. I work with folks at the local level who inspire me every day with their creativity. I think seeing what's happened in communities to open up their outdoor space so businesses can operate. I haven't yet decided to get my hair done outside, but people are being very creative about making that available, and the use of the rights of way. What I've seen in Sacramento when it comes to the Great Plates program and utilizing restaurants who were closed to provide meals to seniors who need to stay at home and need to be safely at home, but need square meals per day. I've seen, we don't have a mutual aid system built into the public health system in the same way that we do for fire services. But I tell you, when El Centro and Imperial County needed bed space in a county next door, they made that available. I am an optimist by nature, and I hearken back to something that he didn't invent it, but I give him credit for it. Rahm Emanuel, who was President Obama's first chief of staff, what he said during the Great Recession, and we were coming out of that, was, let's not waste the opportunities that a crisis presents to us. And so, many of us thought we would never be teleworking or working remote in our organizations. There are 70 great folks at the League of California Cities, and we were all sitting at 14th and K right across the street from the Capitol. And on the turn of a dime, we have been functioning, frankly, quite productively in a remote environment sense. And I think that's the experience of many organizations. So as we think about recovery and reopening, we're all also saying, what are some lessons learned that we want to carry into the future? I don't think we're going to go back. I think we're all going to go forward, taking the best of what's worked as we do that. So I'm inspired too.
Thank you, Carolyn. And Tracy Gordon, what sort of but beyond it's not going to be that bad. What sort of other positive message might you share with us about where we're going in the future?
So I've talked with more federal staffers, analysts, policymakers in the last 6 months than maybe the last couple of years of my career. And I have to say, it's been really gratifying how much they already know and care about the state and local sector. In my field, I think people love to just kind of say, oh, they have no idea what's going on. And that's not true, because if anything, they have a vested interest in making sure that the programs that they care about are reaching their intended recipients. So for me, I feel like, and one legacy of the Great Recession was much better intergovernmental coordination and understanding. And I'm hopeful that that'll be a legacy of this crisis as well.
Thank you. Richard, would you like to close this out? I'd like to thank the panelists, but I'll let you thank them too.
Well, I'm going to thank the panelists. I'm going to thank you, Lois, for moderating a really terrific discussion. Again, Lois Takahashi, Carolyn Coleman, Tracy Gordon, thanks so much for spending an hour of your day with us today. We all learned a lot from you being here.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you so much.